Hi, everyone. I see a few folks coming in and joining. I'm Rachel Doran. I'm the VP of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada, and I have the honor today of being your host and moderator for today's discussion. So just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, for opening the door to cost-saving clean energy solutions for Canadian households. For those of you who may not know us, Clean Energy Canada is a think tank at the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC, located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So I'm just going to start with some housekeeping while folks are connecting in. Do feel free if you have issues or challenges, technical questions. You'll see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The chat has been disabled, but you can reach my colleague Kira Torrance for any support throughout the webinar down in the Q&A icon. We are looking forward to welcoming your questions in the final 30 minutes or so of this webinar. You'll be muted throughout the presentation, so please submit your questions through the Q&A icon. And feel free to ask a question anytime it comes to you. We'll be compiling them and I'll be posing them to our panelists later in the discussion. Now, at the end, we will be circulating a recording of this webinar and a copy of all the slides to everyone who registered. So please feel free to share them widely. We'd love to spread the message. And we will include a link to Clean Energy Canada's amazing weekly newsletter compiled by my communications colleagues. And so if you haven't signed up for it, it's a great way to just stay informed of major events in the energy transition in the course of a week. So in terms of what you're in for today, Clean Energy Canada just released our new report, Opening the Door, which finds that making a few clean energy changes to your household can save hundreds of dollars a month for families in almost every jurisdiction across Canada. And now residents across the country can also get a snapshot of their potential savings via our new online calculator, in which participants can go input their own address and location and get a bit of a sense of the potential savings for a resident of a condo, a townhouse, and detached houses in every province across the country. So I know for many of us, it's been a bit of a dark week for climate action. So I'll start with the good news. Switching your fossil fuel powered car for an electric equivalent saves money in every region of the country in every circumstance that we looked at. While installing a heat pump reduces emissions nearly everywhere and can save money or come out effectively even. So despite the saving benefits of clean technologies, it's true, though, that we've identified the barrier to entry is uneven for those who don't own their own homes and may even be higher for some Canadians than it was a year ago. And this is why at the end, we do want to get into our recommendations that all levels of governments can take to take action. This can include everything from offering rebates that help cut upfront costs to improving charging access, simplifying financing, and improving electricity rates to further incentivize these cleaner options. So we organized this webinar and are thanking you so much for joining us today in order to dig into these results in further detail, discuss implications for different areas of the country, and help share useful information that thought leaders, community leaders, and others can apply in their daily work. We're going to start off today by hearing from Clean Energy Canada Policy Advisor Jana Elbrecht, who will present the report's main findings. And then we'll turn to a roundtable discussion with Communications Director Trevor Melanson and Director of Public Affairs, Joanna Kyriazis, to further unpack the implications of this report. So how can we ensure more Canadians can access these cost savings that come from ditching fossil fuels? As I noted at the outset, the discussion will be followed by a live audience Q&A, so please do tee up any questions you may have, and I can't wait to pose them to our panelists today. So thanks again for joining us. To kick things off, I'm going to turn it over to Jana to give a short presentation on our report Opening the Door and our new online calculator. I'll turn it over to you, Jana.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Rachel mentioned, I will talk you through some of the main findings of our report and how you can use our online tool, which is available at mycleanbill.ca. Yes, I got the slides. Okay. So let me start by talking about why we published this report and why we published it right now. So as most of you will know and will feel every day, for the last few years, cost of living has been on the rise and has also been rising to the top of political agendas. And many of us are concerned about paying the rent, the rising cost of food and groceries, And switching to clean energy technologies to lower your household emissions might not feel like a priority right now. So we wanted to figure out how that concern about affordability interacted with clean energy technologies. And we actually found that there is more reasons to make the switch than just to lower your emissions. And last year, we published a report showing that for a household in the Greater Toronto area, it could actually lead to savings. And this year, we wanted to look into that again and show what those savings could look like for different housing types and in different provinces. And we actually found a lot of potential savings across the country. First and foremost, electric vehicles save money in every province. And when it comes to electrifying your home, so your heating, your cooling, your hot water, the picture looks a little bit different depending on the province you are in. And this is largely due to upfront costs, which make a really big difference. Some provinces offer support, others don't. If you live in an apartment, you usually have fewer options than if you live in a detached house. And we'll dive into some of these things in more detail throughout the presentation. But first, to give you a bit of an idea of what we looked into exactly. So we broadly looked at 4 categories for each home. So swapping out your gas car for electric vehicles, replacing your heating and cooling systems with a heat pump, electrifying your water heater, and finally replacing your stove with an electric one. And this largely has the benefit of cutting off your natural gas connection altogether, which saves you a subscription fee, which in Ontario is over $300 a year, for example. So we looked at 3 different housing types. Sorry, let me just get the slide here. 3 different housing types in each province. And the analysis is based on average energy prices in 2023. So you should really see this as a snapshot, a moment in time, and we will be updating these prices in the future. The comparisons include all of the equipment costs for each of the scenarios. So you should, again, see this as when it comes to the moment that your furnace is about to give out or you're in need of a new car, and that's when you decide how are you going to replace it, and you're either opting for a new furnace and new AC or for a new heat pump. You're opting for a new gas car or a new EV. Yeah, so those equipment costs are included. Important to note, there's no financing costs included. And in every province for the heating and cooling, we used a baseline scenario that uses the province's most common heating fuel. So for most provinces, that's natural gas, but for some, it's oil or electricity. And for each house, we had 3 scenarios, which you'll see more clearly on some of the next slides. So we have a fully fossil fueled house, a fully clean house, but we also have a medium scenario, which we call making some changes. So here is what it looks like for a 4-person family living in a detached home in the Greater Toronto area. So on the left here, you see our fossil fuel powered starting from zero home. So again, this house has an SUV in the driveway, a truck in the driveway, and both of those are powered by gasoline. They heat their home with natural gas. They have a central AC system. They heat their water with natural gas, and they have a gas stove. And then this house on the right, conversely, has an energy bill that is $550 lower per month. And they achieve that by still having an SUV and a truck in the driveway, but making them electric models, and by installing a cold climate heat pump and getting off of natural gas. So when we run the same numbers for pretty much the same household, but we move the household to Metro Vancouver, we find that the savings are even higher. So from $550 in Toronto, we go to close to $800 in Vancouver. And this is largely because of provincial rebates in BC, which bring down the cost of electric vehicles and heat pumps. But there are also some differences in electricity and gas prices, which influence this. And then we have run it for the largest city in every single province and for these 3 housing types. So what we see here is the detached house, and this is a scenario with an SUV and a truck, a townhouse with an SUV and a hatchback, And then for the apartment, we have a 2-person household and they have 1 hatchback. And you can see that there is savings across the board, with one standout here in Calgary, Alberta. And what's important to note here is that the electric vehicle is still cheaper in Alberta. It's just that the overall savings from the house don't add up to savings, actually. And again, here you can see what province has what baseline. So most of these are natural gas. So I have thrown a lot of numbers at you already. So let's talk about how you can use these numbers, how you can make them a little bit more personal and relevant. Along with the report, we launched our website. So this is mycleanbill.ca. You can scan the QR code here. We'll put it up again later. And when you go to the website, you can select what province you live in, what type of house, how many cars you own, and what type of cars. And then your results should look a little something like this. So what is on the slide here are the results for a household in PEI living in a single detached house with an SUV and a truck. And I'll tell you right away that these are some of the highest savings coming out of our calculator. So for other provinces, they might look a little bit lower. And yeah, what you will see in the results is the comparison between the starting from 0 households, the in between making some changes households, and the fully clean energy scenario. And then we can zoom in and look at the bills in a little bit more detail by clicking that button. This is what the bills look like in a little more detail. On the left here, for each bill, we see the different categories, so vehicles, heating and cooling, etc. And then for each of them, we see the operating cost, so that's your energy bill, and the cost of the equipment, and then, of course, a total row to compare. So if we zoom into heating and cooling, for example, we see that in PEI, switching from an oil furnace with central AC to a cold climate heat pump almost cuts your energy bill in half. And in PEI in particular, we see that the equipment cost is actually much lower in the clean energy life scenario because if you were switching from an oil furnace to a heat pump in PEI, you can actually get a free heat pump. So this is a bit of an exceptional scenario where that equipment cost is much lower, and that leads to overall savings in this category of over $250. And we could take you through the nitty-gritty of every category here, but I will leave that for now. And instead, I'll talk about what we can also see in this calculator, which is how much upfront costs matter. So this is the same scenario, but we've taken it from PEI and moved it to the Greater Toronto area. And the baseline here is different. So we're talking here about switching from natural gas to a heat pump. And we see a reduction in the energy bill. So we see a reduction of around $20 a month that you can save by moving to a heat pump. But without rebates from the provincial government in Ontario, the equipment cost is significant in the clean energy scenario. And this means that, you know, if you live in Toronto or the GTA, you can still install a heat pump, reduce your emissions, increase your comfort, but the savings case is a lot less strong than it is in provinces with the rebates. So let's talk about some of the more high-level findings. So as mentioned, EVs are the biggest money savers. And this is the case across the country. If, for example, you switch your SUV to an electric model, you can save, on average, Canada-wide, close to $3,000 a year over a 10-year ownership period. And so even if that electric SUV comes at a little bit of a higher upfront cost, that does pay off and ultimately lead to savings. And as you may know, we have previously published the lifetime savings for 4 different car types. And we've also computed the payoff times. So as I mentioned, the SUV, the electric model, is a little bit, or quite a bit actually, more expensive upfront. But you pay back that difference in savings on average in Canada in a little under 5 years, or 4.5 more like. But for the hatchback comparison, that's actually 2 months. And for the sedan and the truck comparison that we made, with rebates, they are already cheaper when you drive them off the lot, and you will start saving immediately. So final bit here, because we've been talking about households, but governments definitely have a role to play. And most importantly, throughout this presentation, I have talked about the barrier of high upfront costs. And again, like, can you make the investment to actually unlock those savings? And this is where governments can play a big role, and actually where governments of all levels can play a big role. So the federal government still offers interest-free financing through the Greener Homes Loan. And a lot of municipal programs also still exist. So for example, in Burlington and Mississauga and Toronto, you can get interest-free or low-interest financing from the city. And of course, provinces can help. And as I mentioned, a lot of provinces have rebates, for example, on EVs or heat pumps. And beyond that upfront cost, governments can also help by setting the right conditions to unlock those savings. There's a lot of different examples here. So for example, governments can ensure that there's enough renewable energy to go around and that it's affordable. Ensure that you can charge your EV if you live in an apartment building. Ensure that renters have access to some of these savings. And we are very happy to go into some of these policy options. But I will leave that to the panel, I think, and I will hand it back over to Rachel. Oh, but before I do, I will just point out that the QR code is once again up on the slide. So you can type in mycleanbill.ca in your browser, or you can scan the QR code here.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jana. And I note there were a couple of email contacts there as well. If you have questions remaining at the end of the webinar, we'll pop those addresses back up for any follow-ups. But right now, I'd invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras on, and looking forward to a discussion. So I have a few pre-prepared questions. I'm seeing a couple already get dropped into the Q&A. If things are sort of trickling into your mind you want to ask, please do feel free to pop them into the Q&A anytime. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask a few that I'm curious about. So this question is for all of our panelists. Welcome, Joanna. Welcome, Trevor. And I want to ask, what do each of you think in 30 seconds really were the most important takeaways of this research? Like, why should people care? And Joanna, I'm going to go first to you, then Trevor, then Jana.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. I think in terms of why people should care, it's about permanent solutions versus temporary relief. And so what I keep watching various provincial or federal governments offering Canadians at this time where they're struggling with cost of living, they're temporary solutions like, freezing the Ontario gas tax, or temporarily exempting certain households from a carbon price. But the solutions that we're talking about in this report are for forever. Once you can get off volatile fossil fuel prices for good by not relying on them, then you don't need those temporary band-aid solutions anymore. You just get to benefit from cheaper electricity prices, predictable electricity prices, and you get to plug into Canada's homegrown electricity grid, as opposed to relying on a fuel source that is very susceptible to, geopolitical forces and surprises.
Trevor, you want to give your take?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think we're entering in some ways, dark era where, at least in North America here, it feels that top-down climate policy is going to hit some roadblocks, or in some cases be rolled back. And, we need households to literally buy into the transition as a way to create more lasting power. And for a lot of people, their number one concern, as Jana brought up, is going to be affordability. That's going to be their way in. But once you get them in, then I think, there is some research to suggest that people are more likely to adopt additional clean technologies once they've adopted one. CAA did a study of EV drivers in Canada, over 16,000, and like 97% said they were going to get an EV again. They're really satisfied with the car that they got. So I think it's about more than just convincing a person to buy one clean technology, whether it's an EV or a heat pump, and it's about what that opens up, and I think how it transforms people, and from that, how it can transform the broader energy transition.
Thanks, Trevor. Jan, I know you got to say your bit already, but do you have anything you want to add on key takeaways?
Yeah, it's always hard to go last with one of these, but I would say that I've seen a lot of climate action and cost of living being pitted against each other. And, you know, as if lowering emissions or climate is a luxury to care about. And I think part of what we wanted to show here is that they can actually work together a lot of the time. And that clean energy is affordable energy.
Thanks, Jana. I'm actually going to put another one to Trevor now. You know, I think maybe from a communications perspective, you know, what gap is this research filling? What kind of misconceptions do you sometimes hear about clean technologies in the public domain?
Well, I mean, increasingly, we've asked this question a few ways, and something like 60, I want to say about 60% of Canadians are convinced that an electric vehicle at least would cost them less over time than a gas car. But I think and we'd like to get that higher, but it's not a bad start. But I think we would really like for people to understand that break-even point might be even sooner than they think. Because people are very sensitive to the price they have to pay today, not just the price that they're going to pay over time. So I think, you know, something that may be an abstract idea to them, something, or they may think, oh yeah, maybe I'll save a little bit of money after 10 years, like really showing them the scale of the savings and the timeline of the savings to make something long-term feel more short-term, because that's often how people make financial decisions. And as we know, affordability is by far the #1 concern in this country. And unfortunately, climate change has moved down the list a little bit in the last couple of years, despite the fact that we had, you know, another bad wildfire year, despite what happened in Jasper. So, you know, we definitely need to connect with people on this material level that seems to dominate politics, and I think people at the individual level.
Thanks, Trevor. Joanna, I was going to ask you a little bit to dig into Jana's point that EVs really are the biggest money savers in the calculations, but there's also been a couple of EV related questions in the chat, so I might bundle them for you. Someone also wanted to know kind of if we looked at a 10-year lifespan for EVs, what would happen if you rolled this out to more like a 15-year lifespan? And also some concern that they've heard from folks around batteries and maybe batteries only lasting 8 to 10 years and just wanting to know whether newer batteries are going to be longer lasting. So turn it over to you to try and answer all three.
Sure. So in terms of batteries, battery technology is getting better and better every year. We're seeing longer ranges. So the average EV sold now in 2023, let's say, is I think 480 kilometers. Batteries are also charging faster, and they're lasting longer. Batteries are designed to outlive the cars that they're in, and there are often stories about them having second lives, because by the end of their life, they may still hold 80% of their capacity or their charge, or their range, I guess it is. So that may be determined to be the end of the battery's life in the electric vehicle, but they can still go on and be used for battery storage in their grid or something like that. In terms of, I know there's a lot of fear and anxiety around being in a situation where you've got to replace your battery. Few things. The typical warranty that most car makers offer for batteries is 8 years or 160,000 kilometers. So if your battery dies or conks out before then, it's going to be covered under warranty. But then we've been paying attention to studies that do look at the failure rate of batteries. And there were, one of the studies by Recurrent Auto looked at 20,000 electric vehicles and found that the battery failure rate was about 2%, many of which occurred under warranty. And then when you look at the newer, like the cross-section of vehicles that were from like 2016 or later, the failure rate went below 1%. So I think this is a very sensationalized, topic, and people are afraid, but it's just very, very rare that you're going to be faced with a situation where you've got to replace your battery. And then going back to the first part of that question, like what would happen if we looked at a 15-year time span, assuming the battery is still alive or was replaced under warranty, then the savings would just be greater, because with EVs, it's operational savings. It's so cheap to fuel your vehicle. So the more you drive, the more you save. The more kilometers you put on the car, the more you saved compared to a gas car. Did I answer all the questions there?
I think you did. Well, I'm going to challenge Jana next with a bit of a bundled question. So, Jana, in your presentation, you mentioned like there's some inequality in how sort of different people might access savings, and a lot of our calculations were around homeowners. So I'd love it if you could dig in a bit further, like how could renters benefit? Like what can you do that's not necessarily like retrofitting your own home? And I will note there's a couple of more specific questions in the chat around high-rise condo buildings and just whether there are supports in existence right now for high-rise condo dwellers to try to access either at the federal or Ontario levels.
Yeah, this is definitely an important point. And in the calculations and in the report that we did, all of that assumes that you have the agency to make those changes, right? And even when you have the agency to make those changes, there is a lot less support for apartments in multi-unit residential buildings. So BC just came out with a program to fund retrofits in those types of buildings, but in most of the rest of the country, that is not accessible. The federal Greener Homes Loan is not available for people in apartment buildings. I believe only duplexes, maybe triplexes. And there are some funds for affordable housing institutions, but if you live in a regular apartment, you don't have access to any of that. And the same goes for renters. Being a renter myself, I would love to have a heat pump in the building I live in, but there's, unless I persuade my landlord, it's not going to happen, right? And this is another area where governments come in and where regulations of a certain standard of energy efficiency could help for rental units, or labeling so that people can make informed choices about what kind of unit they rent, how much they will be paying for their bills. But of course, beyond the home and the electric vehicle, there are other things you can do. So, and we note this in the report because I know there's often a lot of questions of, what if I don't own a car to begin with? Well, of course, not owning a car is even cheaper. If you can bike. We also made the comparison. Let me just look at my notes here. I think it was $258 per month that you can save if you trade in your SUV for a Toronto Transit Pass. So there are, of course, other things you can do. But we are definitely, from a policy perspective, looking at what can we do to make this accessible to renters and people who live in apartment buildings. And I don't know if I missed one question there, Rachel.
Yeah, if there's anything, people were looking for a bit more specific information on high rises and just whether there's any programs that would meet their needs. But I think you've generally touched on that unless there's anything you want to add, and would just encourage folks to follow up if they do have questions following the webinar. Joanna, Jana has kind of bridged us a little bit here into the role of governments. You're talking every day to local governments. Probably many folks on the webinar here are representatives of local governments. Provinces have a role. The federal government has been playing a role. Could you break down a little bit, like particularly at the local level, what you think governments can and should be doing, but also a bit more about the role of every level of government?
Absolutely. So in terms of federal and provincial government action, kind of the key ways to support EV adoption are rebates. So while the sticker price of new and used EVs has really come down over the past year, often EVs are still slightly more expensive upfront than comparable gas models. And so rebates help to bridge that gap and help unlock those cost savings for EV drivers sooner. The federal government still has a rebate of up to $5,000 for a new electric vehicle. If you are interested in getting an electric vehicle, go out and get it now, because we don't know for sure if that program will still be going very long into the new year, and we don't know if it'll receive more funding. And then almost every province in the country offers rebates for new and used EVs, except for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and unfortunately Ontario. They're all unfortunate. I just live in Ontario. Then investments in public and home charging is another way that federal and provincial governments typically help out. So BC, for instance, offers a 50% rebate of up to $350 for a home charging station. Quebec offers one of up to $600. And both of those provinces, as well as the federal government, have invested pretty heavily in the public network. Last policy tool that is popular at federal and provincial government levels is to put in place sales requirements. So BC and Quebec have sales requirements where car makers need to sell an increasing percentage of EVs in those provinces, and now the federal government has a Canada-wide one as well. I'll try to be quick in terms of what local governments can do. EV readiness requirements in municipal bylaws to make sure that new multi-unit or new condos and apartment buildings offer EV charging at home is one. Over 20 municipalities in BC have adopted these requirements. Richmond, Burnaby, North Van are examples. Cities can offer preferred parking options for EVs, whether it's like reduced parking fees or priority access for curbside parking spots. The city of Montreal at least used to offer reduced parking fees for EVs. I'm not sure if that changed just recently, but that's an example. And the city of Montreal has a ton of on-street parking, which is not as common as it should be yet in Canada. The city of Ottawa is developing an EV strategy for personal vehicle use. And one of the things it's done is engage with the public to understand, like, where would we most want charging stations to be installed? And then the last example is encouraging or requiring private sector investment in charging. So the city of Vancouver is actually changing its business licensing fees and imposing $10,000 on gas stations and large parking lot owners that do not install EV charging stations. So that's a way to get the private sector involved.
Thanks, Joanna. We can go back to an audience question again. This one time for you, Jana. We saw one little red line there across the country. Why is Calgary so much out of line with the rest of the country?
There's multiple reasons for that. And again, I'll say that this comes down mostly to the house electrification and not the electric vehicles, which still lead to savings in Alberta, even if those savings are a little lower than elsewhere in the country. It comes down to a combination of no provincial rebates, no support for any of these technologies, very high electricity rates. Electricity rates in Alberta are more than double what they are in Ontario. So that makes electrifying a less appealing option, and especially when combined with very cheap natural gas. And yeah, then the final point is what we looked at is an air source heat pump. So it draws on heat from the outside air, and they work really well. Cold climate air source heat pumps work really well up until like minus 30 degrees Celsius. But they do get a little bit less efficient once it gets that cold. And of course, in Calgary, you have those real winters that we don't get here in Toronto. So that drives up the energy usage a little bit. So if you live in a very cold climate in Canada, you might also want to consider looking at, for example, a ground source heat pump, which is something that we did not look at in this analysis. So can't tell you anything on the cost of that yet, but yeah, there are other options to look at.
Thanks, Jana. Trevor, I'm going to pose one to you. We've just been talking about, whether there's equal access for people like renters or Anyone else who might find that just for a cost price or other reasons, they're feeling, like there are some real adoption barriers here. How do you think we could speak effectively to people who might feel left behind and less unable to unlock some of these savings?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because, in the polling that some polling done that I've seen is that younger people are actually on average more open to adopting clean technologies. So electric vehicles, e-pumps as well by a bit of a margin. So you've got basically a willing slice of Canadians who are more likely to be in a situation where they have lower incomes, they live in a condo building or they rent. All of these things are actual, not just perceptions, are actual barriers to adopting an EV. So, I mean, there's a communication side and there's a policy side to this because some of those are real barriers and we want to find ways to overcome them, right? So, getting charging options into condo buildings or better public charging networks so that people can rely on them in the way that they would rely at a gas station. And in some parts in Canada, you can do that, but it's not everywhere. And how we speak about them, I think, definitely needs to feel well. We often talk about your next car, right? When this is what makes sense for your next car. I don't tell people, oh, you bought a new car 3 years ago, you should get rid of it and buy an EV. I don't tell people that. They wouldn't respond very well to it. And I think similarly, when you're talking to someone who's 20 years old, their first car is probably going to be used. It's going to be like a 2000 Camry or something like that. And I'm not going to tell them they should buy a $45,000 EV. So for them, like the message is probably your first new car. And you're not, and you're bringing them in, right? You understand their timeline, and you talk about the things that you're doing to make things to give them better access, right? Because look, if I'm 20, I'm not buying a house yet, I'm not buying an EV yet, but I want to move toward that. And so, like, what are you doing to help me get there? And I think in the same way that we do, politicians in this country realize they need to do things to improve the housing situation and access to housing for younger people, or just people who don't feel they're in a strong position to acquire it. Similarly, we need to make sure that people who are in situations where they don't have access to a garage, for example, or they are unable to finance a larger amount of debt, even if that would pay them back over time, that we're thinking about them and we're taking actions, and governments are taking actions to help them.
Thanks, Trevor. I have two questions I'm going to lump together here from the audience, both a little bit about how we kind of think about our methodology, and particularly around EVs. So maybe I'll go to you first, Joanna, and then I would welcome other folks to chime in. But the first question is sort of why is it relevant not to include borrowing costs, and that maybe that's understandable for home renos because of the Greener Homes loan, but maybe harder to understand for EVs. So sort of why isn't that included? And do estimated savings from EVs reflect any costs associated with electrical infrastructure upgrades that might be required to meet increased demand for EV charging? So anything you want to say around the methodology for EVs on either of those pieces?
Yeah, I'll take a crack and then I might send it over to Trevor or Jana. So the methodology, we did not include potential costs related to upgrading the electrical grid. That isn't a necessary part of adopting an electric vehicle, and people's charging situations are so different. I think a lot of people assume that they need to install a level 2 charger, but there's a Canada-specific study that showed about 80% of Canadians could get away with not doing that, in which case you're just plugging into your regular outlet and no electrical upgrades are required. That's what I do, and it was easy breezy. So I have heard anecdotally that some people do though need to upgrade their electrical panel, and that can be expensive. But even in that case, the range that you might get quoted is going to change based on your housing type, how old the distribution grid is, what region you live in, and so we couldn't really come up with a kind of like a generalized estimate of what that should or could be, but it's a factor in some people's decision making for sure. And then In terms of the borrowing costs, Trevor, I think you might be better placed to answer this one.
Sure. Yeah, I can take a crack at it. Yeah, and then the charging thing, I also use a level 1 charger, and I have a plug for level 2 in my house. I could just plug in a level 2 charger. It's like the easiest thing in the world for me, and I just haven't needed to do it yet. Maybe one day I will. And say if you're actually someone who does need to use a level 2 charger, it's because you're driving a lot, which means you're going to save even more by getting an EV. In terms of, not including financing costs, it was a tricky decision because there's not an easy way to approach that. People come at buying a car from very different perspectives. Like some people, it's their first car and they're financing most of it. Other people are trading in money and they have a bit of savings, and it's quite a small car loan. And it's hard to get a normal on that. If you have a tool that allows people to like put in their personal information to that precise level, that makes sense. But when you're trying to come up with a sort of like nationwide universal number to help people understand the bigger savings picture, we opted to simplify it. And somebody pointed out that the Greener Homes grant is available on the sort of household side, and that's true. And I would point out that while EVs are on average a little bit more expensive upfront, but again, not that much these days, and therefore financing something with a bigger capital cost, would in theory favor the gas car like a tiny little bit. On the flip side, I think the advantage would probably math out greater where you can get a heat pump system installed in your home with under the $40,000 max Greener Homes grant with no interest, were you to finance that. So that's like a zero versus whatever it would cost you to finance the fossil fuel version of that. So I'm not, just to say that, like, I don't, and Joanna, maybe you have more information on this, but I don't know that this would math out in favor of the fossil fuel household. Given the Greener Homes alone, it may actually favor the clean energy household.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that, we did not include those interest rates, but I agree with Trevor that the Greener Homes loan with zero interest financing, which you cannot get anywhere else anymore, is a real big opportunity to save. So as Joanna said, we did not include any electrical upgrades for the EV side. Our heat pump equipment cost does include a cost for a small panel upgrade. So that is part of the math there.
Thanks, everybody. Now I have a question from me here, only because you cannot read an op-ed or a newspaper article or anything this week without asking, what is the impact of the US election on what you've discovered here? So we'd love if people want to take a little crack at, what has the potential to change? What has the potential to stay the same? Is there going to be any impact? Joanna, I might go to you first, our Director of Public Affairs.
Well, on the EV front, there's still a lot of question marks. Certainly, President Trump ran on a platform that was pretty a platform is a generous term. He had a lot of anti-EV sentiment in his public comments. I think we don't know yet if he will cancel the EV tax credits that are available for American consumers. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure if he does what the impact will be. Like, on the one hand, it could convince provincial and federal governments in Canada to do the same. On the other hand, maybe it frees up more inventory for Canadians, and improves affordability for Canadians who want to go electric, because there's not as much competition for supply with the US. It's hard to know what the dynamics are there. Trying to think what else. Again, like, a lot is just to be, like, we don't know exactly what he'll do. I think Trump has promised to roll back the tailpipe emission regulations that encourage car makers to invest more in EVs and sell more EVs in the US and therefore in Canada. And I think there's a good chance that those will be rolled back. We don't know if Canada will follow suit. There's the possibility that we'll want to, stick to our own clean car trajectory going forward. And then we also luckily have our zero emission vehicle, or our EV availability standard that requires car makers to sell more EVs here in Canada. So hoping that holds up, even if Trump does roll back some of the tailpipe emission standards that support EVs. Yeah. Provincially is maybe the last thing I'll say is that US states, about 40% of the US car market is under US states that are more ambitious when it comes to clean cars. They've adopted California's ZEV mandate. And so we expect to see them continuing to go full force ahead. And so Canada will have state level partners if we do want to stick to our EV targets.
Thanks, Joanna. Trevor, Jana, do either of you want to add any projections here?
Do you want to go first, or do you jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think one thing that I felt very much is weak is that we don't have influence on other countries' elections or governments, and in many ways that's probably a good thing. But that is, I think, a good reminder of the difference between relying on fossil fuels, where the markets are global and the price you pay at the pump is not just determined by Canadian politics, but it's determined by global conflicts. What's happening in Russia and Ukraine and the Middle East, all of that determines oil prices. And those are some of the most volatile prices and really can lead to price shocks for Canadians. And those global politics can play into your everyday lives. Whereas electricity, that is something that we can produce locally. That's mostly a local market. And that's, if you look at historical prices, has been a lot more stable. And so I think it's just yet another reminder that we should be, if we're in a lot of the conversations that are moving towards, security or like, I don't want to say Canada first politics. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. But, how can we use the advantages that we have here and build on those and ensure that we have locally produced clean electricity that we can rely on.
Thanks, Jana. Trevor, you want to round us out?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I would point out that when you're talking about household clean technology adoption, it's something where you can have jurisdictions right next to each other going in way different directions. I mean, Norway, pretty much 100% of car sales now in Norway are electric, right? I mean, Scandinavia is doing okay, but it's just doing its own thing, right? And even here in Canada, the picture is very different in different provinces, like uptake in places like Quebec and BC are a lot higher than they are elsewhere, including Ontario. And America, of course, is going to be a fragmented nation where some states like California are charging ahead and other ones are lagging behind. But we can make the choice to go ahead for good reasons, and we don't, whatever parts of America does, it does not need to impede how we progress, especially at that household level, And I think that one thing we're realizing is that we need, as I said earlier, we need change to happen at that household level, because that creates political resilience. I mean, I think I look at America, and there are different ways America could have approached its climate ambitions, and through the IRA, it was a lot of money out the door kind of measures. And that seems to have been a good thing in retrospect, because a lot of those manufacturing plants in red states seem safer than a regulation might have been, right? A lot of the EV tax credits are already out the door. They've already made their impact, right? And so, I think that that's increasingly how I think about climate action and in terms of political resilience, especially in this new era of a Trump government, is how do we win people over at that household level and sort of create change that's a little more transformational.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to go back to a few audience questions before we run out of time here. There's two maybe interrelated questions here, both about, government tax revenue. The first one is asking, as government tax revenue decreases as gasoline consumption decreases, is there any fear that taxes on electricity will simply increase to recover lost revenue? And second, government taxes to maintain roads are currently collected through gasoline diesel fuel sales. Since EVs will continue to use roads, it's likely governments will need to connect this revenue through another mechanism. Did we factor in those costs for EV ownership and we modeled those into the longer term? So did you want to respond to either of those? Maybe Joanna first?
Yeah, in terms of the EV, like the gas tax, I think that's a question that's commonly asked. I think gas tax revenue goes into general revenues and is used for a whole broad range of things, at least a whole range of infrastructure costs. So it's not directly going, or it's not only going towards road maintenance. But I think that's, you know, it is an interesting issue, and it is something that we will have to think about down the road to get other forms of revenue generation to feed into road maintenance and repair. And that could be something like congestion pricing, parking fees. I personally would like to see the fees be based on vehicle weight, because that, you know, the heavier the vehicles, the more wear and tear on the roads we're seeing. And so a lot of the really heavy pickup trucks that are, you know, traveling Canadian roads are actually going to be the most responsible for some of that road maintenance. So I assume that will be a live issue and something that governments will be thinking about when we get further down the line of limited gas tax revenues. And then the other question was, what was the other question, Rachel?
I think they're both in, I think you can address them both. They're just a little bit around, did we model this in? Did we forecast it? How are governments going to collect these revenues? So I think you've mostly touched on it, unless you wanted to add anything else.
Happy to have others add in. Yeah.
I was going to say, I was looking, I've heard this one before, and I found a great blog post by Patrick Johnson, who's the mayor of New Westminster, and a real policy walk. And he estimated that the average person was spending maybe like that general revenue was maybe like $20 a year was going toward to roads. Mostly it's paid for by municipalities. So I would need to dig deeper into this, but you know, I don't want to overstate the problem or suggest this is blowing a huge hole in government revenue. It can't be easily made up elsewhere.
Trevor, I might stay on you only because Clean Energy Canada has done a lot of work combating sort of common questions around electric vehicles, and I've got a couple of them in the chat. So feel free to answer or turn it over to others. But one question is EV availability in Canada still a problem? I've heard, you know, there's sort of a drop in uptake. Is this happening, you know, in the EU as well, or just in Canada? And also around kind of depreciation and the average retail value. Do EVs selling values fall more quickly than a gas equivalent gas car's selling value?
So it's on EV uptake and depreciation. Yeah, I mean, EV uptake has not declined. I mean, I'm hearing good things about Q3 and how those numbers look. And I know Chevy was bragging about how many Equinoxes it sold in Q3, and they seem really happy. So I think, you know, S-curves aren't necessarily clean lines. There's going to be there's going to be hills and valleys, but the trajectory is generally up. Here in Canada, globally, it's definitely up. China now 50% or more of cars sold in China are electric. Okay, it's a huge bloody market. So no, I don't think EVs are in decline overall, even if there is some hills and valleys and how that's unfolding. You know, in terms of depreciation, like, I mean, well, first of all, like if used EVs are selling for cheaper, that's in one sense a good thing, because it actually brings more people in the market who otherwise couldn't, who maybe can afford a $20,000 or $25,000 car, but couldn't afford a new EV, right? So there's a good thing there. In terms of whether or not they're depreciating faster, I mean, you need to segment different kinds of EVs here, right? Like a 2012 Nissan Leaf it had pretty low range to begin with and higher battery degradation is going to reach a point where it feels like, well, can I really rely on a car that has, you know, less than 100 kilometers of range left on it versus a new EV that has a lot of range on it with minimal degradation? Obviously, is still going to hold its value better. We also have to keep in mind that EVs have been going down in cost in many cases, like Teslas have been going down. So if a new model goes down in price, that's going to depreciate the older versions of the model. Again, that's a good thing, but it is going to cause some depreciation. And I think one area to look into as well, which is a wonkier topic, is the effect of incentives on depreciation as well. Are you measuring depreciation against the post-incentive price of the car? And that's complicated because different jurisdictions have different, sometimes stacking incentives. But in a given market, like the true market value of that cost is what I can buy that car for today after incentives. Again, that's different in different places, and it's going to change over time, and it makes the depreciation picture a little bit murky. But in general, we want EV prices to decline, and to the extent that that has an effect on depreciation, is a good thing for people buying used cars.
Feel free to add in, and Joanna, you're our last question we have answer time for. So I'll say someone else was also asking about whether or not provincial governments could be adding zero interest loans to help people get into used EVs. So if you wanted to respond to that too.
Yeah, I just want to say, like Trevor talked about potentially peaks and valleys with EV uptake. There's no valley. EV uptake is just continuing to break records in Canada. October was the highest month ever for federal rebate claims, and last quarter was the highest volume of EVs registered in the country ever. And as Trevor said, we're hearing that the third quarter numbers are going to be even better, like significantly better. Same is true in the US, where the US is still, the last numbers that came out are the highest that we've ever seen. So it is true in the EU, some countries that have removed their incentive programs this year, like Germany, or significantly limited them, like France, are seeing sales dips. But part of that is because right before the incentives went away, there was a huge rush of buyers to go out and get them. And so, the contrast between the last quarter where there's incentives and then as soon as they go away is going to be stark. So media headlines are definitely over exaggerating little blips, if there even are any out there. And then the other question was,
Do you know if any provincial governments are thinking about adding zero interest loans so that people, maybe lower income families, could get into a cheaper used EV?
Yeah, no, I am not aware of any provincial governments thinking about that right now, but it's a great idea, and there's no reason that they shouldn't. I think at this point, all of the provincial governments offering incentives for EVs at all are offering rebates for used. Perhaps when money starts to get tight, or those programs start running down, and they need some options for how they can continue to support EVs but spend less, then that's a great time to raise that. We definitely will, and encourage others on the call to do that too in any of your government relations or advocacy efforts.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So I just have to thank panelists and thank everyone who stayed through with us until the end. There was a couple of great questions we didn't get to on more ways we could avoid electric panel upgrades, or how do you use power management systems. And so I'm going to leave a teaser in that Clean Energy Canada will be doing some more work in the space of kind of thinking about home energy management and how do you make your clean, smart home work for you. So stay tuned for future work in that space. And just wanted to say thank you again so much for joining us. We will be sending a follow-up email shortly with all the detailed information. And maybe as folks are logging off, Kira, if you could put the slide up with contact information in case there are follow-up questions. And wherever you are and whatever you're doing for the rest of your day, thank you for your time and attention, and hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.